In many ways, the convict leasing system was in fact worse than slavery.
So in the contract, the number 2 stipulation is that the convicts whose labor is to be furnished under this contract shall be Negroes.
Would you rather be black and live to be 100 or white and live to be 50?
1865 is often remembered as the year the chains were broken. 4 million people who had been treated as property for 2.5 centuries were suddenly told they were masters of their own destiny. But in the shadows of the Reconstruction South, a new set of chains was being forged, not in a blacksmith shop, but in the legislative halls of Mississippi, South Carolina, and Alabama. The 13th Amendment contained a loophole large enough to fit a whole new system of bondage through it. It abolished slavery, yes, except as a punishment for crime. Within months of the war's end, Southern lawmakers realized that if they couldn't own black bodies, they could simply criminalize black life. This is the history of the vagrancy laws, the legal freedom trap that rebuilt the plantation economy under a different name. By late 1865, the South was in economic ruin. The labor force they had stolen for centuries was now free to walk away, to seek families, and to negotiate wages. To prevent this, Southern states enacted the Black Codes. The centerpiece of these codes was the Vagrancy Law. In Mississippi, the law defined a vagrant so broadly that it was virtually impossible for a black person to avoid the label. A vagrant was anyone idle, disorderly, or anyone who misspent what they earned. Most importantly, the law required every black adult to provide written evidence of employment for the coming year every single January. If you didn't have that piece of paper signed by a white employer, you were a criminal. If you had the paper but left your job because of abuse or lack of pay, you were a runaway and by extension a vagrant. Under the Black Codes, freedom was only legal if a white man was profiting from it. Mississippi also enacted the apprenticeship law on November 22, 1865. Under this law, local courts were given the power to bind out black children as apprentices. This applied to orphans, but the law included a predatory clause. It also applied to children whose parents were deemed unfit or unable to provide for them. In a post-war economy where black families had been stripped of everything, poverty was easily weaponized as unfitness. The law mandated that preference be given to the former owner of the child. This meant that a child who had just been freed could be legally returned to the very person who had previously enslaved them. These apprenticeships lasted until age 18 for girls and 21 for boys. The conditions were chilling. The master was granted the legal right to use moderate corporal punishment, the same physical violence used under chattel slavery. If a child tried to run away and return to their biological parents, the law treated them as a fugitive. The master had the right to pursue, recapture, and bring them back to labor without pay. Once a man was declared a vagrant, the system moved with terrifying efficiency. He would be arrested, often by patrols made up of the same men who had hunted his ancestors as slave catchers. He was taken before a judge and fined. In Mississippi, these fines often reached $50 or $100. To a man who had been enslaved his entire life and possessed zero capital, $50 was an impossible sum. It might as well have been $1 million. When the fine couldn't be paid, the law allowed the county sheriff to hire out the prisoner to any person who would pay the fine in exchange for the prisoner's labor. This was the return of the auction block. The state had effectively become the master, selling the labor of its citizens to the highest bidder to satisfy a debt created by the state itself. The individual was forced back onto the same plantations, doing the same work under the same supervisors. But now it was called justice. This was the beginning of the industrialization of the New South. Between 1870 and 1930, the convict leasing system became a massive revenue generator for southern states. Alabama, at one point, derived 10% of its entire state revenue from leasing out its prisoners. Companies like the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company realized that convict labor was actually more profitable than slavery had ever been. Under chattel slavery, a master had a financial incentive to keep an enslaved person alive as a capital investment. But under convict leasing, the supply of vagrants was endless. If a man died in a coal mine or on a railroad track, the company simply asked the sheriff for another vagrant. Historians like Douglas A. Blackman call this slavery by another name, and the statistics back it up. In some years, the mortality rate in these labor camps was higher than that of the most brutal antebellum plantations. For decades, the true scale of convict leasing was buried, literally. In 2018, construction crews in Sugar Land, Texas, uncovered the remains of 95 individuals at the site of a former plantation. These weren't just prisoners. They were the victims of the leasing system.
The discovery of human remains at a construction site in Sugar Land opened a window into a dark period in Texas history, the convict leasing system targeting African Americans. Tonight, we talked to local activists who uncovered the actual contracts used in the system. Jessica Borg is in Galveston with the story. Jessica?
Len, the Rosenberg Library here in Galveston is where activists found the contracts used in the state's convict leasing system. They provide valuable information and insight into that dark period of time. Although the documents state what activists suspected they would, they tell me it is still powerful and disturbing to see it in print. These are copies of contracts from 1891, 1893, and 1895 between the Galveston-based Ball Hutchings and Company and Texas State Penitentiaries. The contracts are for farm labor.
So in the contract, the number 2 stipulation is that the convicts whose labor is to be furnished under this contract shall be Negroes.
That line is disturbing and very telling for activist Samuel Collins.
So it was not just simply about convicts. It was specific convicts that they were trying to basically re-enslave.
Collins has been trying to shed light on the state's convict leasing system for years. The subject recently got international attention when 94 sets of remains were discovered by construction crews at the site of a former plantation in Sugar Land. Experts believe the remains belong to black prisoners, among them former slaves, leased out to private businesses so that the state could make a profit. Archaeologists say here the prisoners were as young as 14 to as old as 74.
It shows you that the system was being used even against children, sometimes locking children up as early as 10, 11 years old.
But why would the company pay for a prisoner instead of a free laborer? The economics tell the story. In the late 1800s, the average agricultural wage for a free worker in Texas was between $13 and $14 a month. However, companies were paying the state $17 a month per inmate. They were paying a premium for convict labor. Why? Because you could extract more productivity from a prisoner. A free man could quit or complain about conditions. A convict was a captive. For that extra $3 a month, a company bought the right to work a human being to the brink of death with zero legal oversight. Beyond the physical labor, we have to account for the black fatigue, the profound psychological exhaustion of living in a society where your very existence is a potential crime. Imagine the mental load of never being able to stand on a street corner, never being able to travel to see a relative, and never being able to quit a job without the looming threat of a chain gang. This induced a state of permanent hypervigilance. Every interaction with a white person was a high-stakes negotiation for your freedom. This is where the biological cost begins. The chronic stress of navigating the freedom trap contributed to what we now recognize as weathering, the premature aging of the body due to systemic stressors. The vagrancy laws didn't just steal time, they stole health, longevity, and the ability for families to build a foundation of safety. The black codes were eventually struck down, but the DNA of the vagrancy laws and convict leasing remained. These statutes evolved into loitering laws, order maintenance policing, and modern stop and frisk policies. The core idea remained. The state maintains the right to monitor, stop, and penalize black movement in public spaces. True freedom requires more than the absence of change. It requires the presence of self-determination and a right to exist without being documented by a system that views your presence as a threat. Because in the history of America, the law has often been the very thing that makes freedom the most dangerous place to be when you're black. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into historical accounts of black fatigue and systematic racism.